Hello everyone, and welcome back to Think Outside the Board for another edition of the Kickstarter Weekly. Today's episode is going to look at crowdfunding projects that are completing their funding between April the 25th and May the 1st. I have 5 different campaigns that I'm going to highlight today, but before I do that, I'm going to first talk about the 4 games that I've played since last week's video. The first of these is Bonfire, and that's the new Stefan Feld game. I say new, but it's from 2020. I'm currently trying to complete all the remaining games from 2020 that I feel I need to catch up on before I can put out my best of 2020 list. I am planning on doing a top 30 list, so it'll be fairly deep and it'll have more games on it than maybe other top 10 lists did. Now, I haven't played a lot of Stefan Feld games. I have the Castles of Burgundy. I've played a couple other ones. I've been backing the New York City collection games, which include a new version of Macau. There's a new game on there, a couple other games that have been updated, including Bruges. So I'm looking forward to those. I do, however, have in my collection Luna and Bonfire, and those are 2 games that I've still needed to get played. I'm actually going to be playing Luna this week, I think, and I'm excited for that. But Bonfire, I think, is a really amazing game. Just in one play, it went right up to the top of my list. I think it's a game that I'm never going to sell. I do have Merlin as well. That's another Feld game. But I anticipate that even if I pare back my collection later to a core group of Felds, a few Felds, I can't see Bonfire not being in that core group. Thematically, players are playing tribes of gnomes. They all live in this kind of fantasy world, and there are these guardians who kept these bonfires lit up. I believe that's kind of how they kept magic going in this world. And the gnomes have journeyed to the center where the guardians are, and the guardians are all gone, except for one of them. And the bonfires are all out, except for one of them. So the game sees players and their tribes of gnomes going out, taking ships out to these little islands, completing tasks, and then using those tasks to relight bonfires and essentially keep the magic going in the world. What players are mainly trying to do to score points is to take these tasks and then complete tasks and then acquire different kinds of guardians onto their player boards, and through a whole series of mechanics that includes getting portals and different lit paths and getting guardians and having them walk along these paths. They're trying to get some of these guardians into the bonfires to help protect the bonfires. So completing the tasks and lighting them and making them into bonfires and then getting guardians to protect them, those are the 2 biggest ways you'll score points in this game. But there's also ways like getting portals in front of a lit bonfire or matching the light, the color of the light of the path that's near a bonfire to the color of that bonfire. There's a few other things. So there are other ways to score some points, but completing the tasks and getting the guardians to protect them are the 2 main ways you'll score points, the most points. And I found this game to be such a good collection of mechanics that really, really work well together. I know that the strengths of Stefan Feld games aren't always the theme, and the theme here, I suppose, could be viewed as thin, but not to me. I thought the theme here was really cool, and the whole idea of this going on in this world of these gnomes trying to prove themselves to the guardians and relight these bonfires, I found it very compelling, and it really brought me into the world of the game. It very much came alive for me. So I liked the theme, I liked the way the mechanics worked with it, and I thought for a heavier game, this is definitely on the heavy end. I'm not sure where it lies within all of Feld's games, although I do know that a lot of his games tend to play more in the medium light range. So I believe this is one of his heavier games, and I thought it was gold, Jerry. Solid gold. Really, really good game. I'm looking forward to playing this again soon. You can play it solo. It seems to me like it's going to play very well at different player counts, and I'm liking the game so much that I do want to try it at all of the different player counts. So my score may get amended over the next several weeks as I play the game more, But for right now, I'm really loving this game. I think very highly of it. I'm going to be rating it a 9.0 for the time being after my first play. From there, I'm moving on to a game called Broom Service. I've played this a few times in past weeks. Thematically, it feels a little bit like Kiki's Delivery Service, the board game, if you're familiar with that Studio Ghibli movie. It's about a witch in this very cute town learning her powers and kind of running a delivery service. And the game is themed around witches, and it's a pickup and delivery game. So it feels kind of like that theme. Now it's designed, or I should say it's co-designed by Alexander Pfister, who's one of my favorite designers. He's designed games like Great Western Trail and Maracaibo. I just think he's a great designer. However, this isn't an original design of his. He actually came on board and helped another designer redesign an older game called Witch's Brew. So this game, Broom Service, is both of them working together to put a new spin on that game. And there's a lot that I like about it. I like the theme. I like the card play in general, the way that you kind of deliver potions and move around the board. And I like the tiles. And I don't mind the fact that it's got art. I think it's by Vincent Dutrait, who's a great artist. It's got very appealing art, although it feels very like a child's storybook. So I don't know. Some gamers might look at it and think that the art feels too juvenile to them, but I really like it. But my biggest problem with the game is there is a heavy amount of take that in the game, to the point where the central mechanic is kind of this card selection mechanic, where every round a player will select 4 of their 10 cards to use during that round. And there's a stronger version of the action called the brave version and a weaker version called the cowardly version. Now, anytime you are starting out a round, you go to play your card, you can choose cowardly or brave. But if you choose brave and someone else has also selected that card for that round, chances are you're not going to get to take the action at all. So there is a decision-making process that's at the center of the game every time you play a card, whether you want to do the weak action of the card that may not really do what you need to do, or the brave action, which will allow you to do what you want to do in full, but that action can essentially be stolen from you or negated. And I found that in playing it, oftentimes you really need to play conservatively and play that cowardly version, which doesn't allow you to do that much. I've had a couple games where whenever I've taken the brave action, literally every time I've taken the brave action, the other player has that card. And so I lose that action. Now, oftentimes if that action is trying to move you into a new region, you may have cards already picked out for that round that are going to move you to other regions. But you have to be in that first region to be able to move into the other regions. So I had one round where, a player playing brave on top of me playing brave and canceling out my action meant that I didn't get to do that action in that round. And then 2 of the other actions that I had planned to play, I could no longer do because I was no longer in a position to do it. So you can, quite often, if you're me, end up, instead of getting to take your 4 actions for the round, only being able to take 2 or maybe 1 action. And to me, that's just a real problem for the game. So even though I don't mind the kind of lighter complexity of the game, the theme I actually find to be fun, that take that gameplay is too constrictive in the game. It can derail your plans too much, I feel. I don't mind a little bit of it in the game, but when your entire, plan for the round can just get reduced to nil, it can be a hard pill to swallow within the game, but it can also make playing the game feel purposeless. You get to do such a small amount of what you had planned. It can be very, very frustrating. And I mean, people who get frustrated could be very frustrated by this game, but people who don't get easily frustrated, they may not be frustrated, but they may not want to play the game again, just with the way that, the penalties to your actions can kind of compound on themselves. So when I'd played the game a couple weeks ago, I think I'd rated it a 6.5. After having played the full version of the game with all of the tiles in on the back side of the board, which makes it a more complex game, and I was hoping that that version would actually endear me to the game more because I do like more complex games. It didn't. They were just a few cosmetic additions, some additional tiles, but they didn't adjust that central gameplay mechanic problem. I see it as a problem. In fact, in some ways it made it worse. One of my 2 character pawns ended up in an area of the board that they couldn't even get out of. And then I was in a situation for the second half of the game where I couldn't even move around in this area because I would need to play 1 card to kind of get out from my little corner. And every time I played that, the other player had it. And then I would have, cards for the other areas, but then I couldn't use those either. So it was a gameplay of kind of compounding problems and compounding frustrations. And I mean, ultimately it's fine. It just means, though, that it's a game that I'm not going to really reach for. I'm going to find a different game in my collection that doesn't have that element and play that 99% of the time, which means that Broom Service is a game I should not keep in my collection. My fiance Kristen, who really does not like competitive games, especially games that are directly competitive with high amounts of take that, she likes it even less than I do. So she doesn't want to play it at all anymore. So I think everything taken together, this is a game that is now exiting my collection, even though it's by Alexander Pfister, who's a designer that I really like. And there may be players who really like games with heavy amounts of take that and competitiveness. And this may be the game for you. This was not the game for me. My overall rating has now gone down from a 6.5 to a 5.0. That's where the rating's going to remain. And I plan on no longer playing this game. I'm going to sell the game. If I'm out there in the wild and someone wants to play the game with me, on their copy, I'm happy to play it, but it's not a game that I will ever probably seek out again. I also got to play in Of the Fox and the Forest, which is a trick-taking game that my fiance Kristen got me for Christmas. We finally just played it for the first time. It's been a few months. Now, I'm not a huge fan of trick-taking games, and this is a very simple trick-taking game with 3 different suits of cards. The way that the game works is if you win the suit, you start again. The one thing that really kind of mixes it up is that the odd numbers in each suit have powers on it, and they do little things that'll happen that make the game a little bit more interesting. Now, there's a mechanic in the game where if you get all of the tricks, if you win all of the tricks, you will get no points for the round. So you are incentivized to either try to lose and get a very low number of tricks. That'll get you a lot of points. I think winning 0 to 3 tricks in a 13 trick round will get you a lot of points. Or getting a range, it's not quite all of the tricks, but a little bit lower. I think it's like 7 to 10 tricks or something. That will also earn you a large number of points. So when you're playing this game, you're trying to, each round, win most of the tricks, but not all. Or if you start to lose a lot of tricks, you can just really lean into that and try to lose as many as you possibly can. That's the decision-making space of this game. It's just a very simple, light trick-taking game, but it has to do with how many tricks are you going to win. For whatever reason, my fiancée Kristen really didn't like the game. It was kind of giving her a high level of anxiety. And I tried to talk to her about it because she does like other card games, other trick-taking games. And I think one of the reasons that she bought this is she figured this is a little bit more of a board game. It's still a trick-taking game. We've played The Crew, which is a cooperative trick-taking game, and we both really like that. So I think she thought, let me get him a board game that's a trick-taking game, and that'll be in our sweet spot. She ended up really not liking it, and I'm not sure quite why. I don't know if it was those powers in the cards or what, but she does like plenty of other just normal trick-taking games that you'd play with playing cards. Gin, rummy, all the kinds of standard card games. But she didn't like this one at all. And I have to say, for my own personal taste, it's not a hit for me either. I just found it such a light game that it wasn't interesting to me. There weren't really interesting decisions to be made in the game. It was just a fast and furious trick-taking game. It plays very quickly, and you're just trying to get most but not all of the tricks or lose a lot of tricks. I need something more from my game. Now, if you like trick-taking games, you may really like this game. I know a lot of people do really love this game, and it is a simple game to teach. It's a smaller box. So it's easy to take with you when you go places. Something that you can very easily whip out and teach to somebody and play in a small setting. But for me, it didn't do enough. It didn't do anything that I found compelling or that made me want to keep playing it. So I know that for some people the game is very well regarded. Some people may really like it. For me, I'm scoring it a 4.0. Even with the punishing elements of Broom Service, I still preferred Broom Service because I felt like at least you were making choices, you kind of took some risks. I didn't like the way that those risks sometimes would pay off or not pay off or fail you, but there was a decision-making space in that game that existed that offered some compelling decisions. I just didn't feel that way about the Fox in the Forest at all. I'd rather scroll through the news items on my phone than play the Fox in the Forest. So it's not a terrible game. It's not a broken game. Some people may really like it. For me, a simple trick-taking game like this, it just doesn't do anything for me. So 4.0. Now the final game that I played was called Tawantinsuyu, the Inca Empire. It is a game from 2020, another one of those 2020 games that I'm trying to get played. And it is part of that T game series from Board and Dice, most of which have been designed by or co-designed by Daniel Tascini. This one I think is actually an exception because Tascini is not involved with Tawantinsuyu. It's just a David Turksey design, and he's been involved as a co-designer with some of the other. And when I say the T board game series from Board and Dice, I'm talking about games like Teotihuacan, which was followed by Trismegistus, The Ultimate Formula, which was then followed by these two games, Tekenyu, Obelisk of the Sun, and Tawantinsuyu, the Inca Empire. And then most recently they've put out Tabanusi, Builders of Ur, I think. So those are 5 games that are very much in that series. Daniel Tascini's also designed The Voyages of Marco Polo, and I think its sequel, and a few other things. But in general, these T games, I think, are very good games. I will say that Tawantinsuyu and Tekenyu came out around the same time, the same year. I played Tekenyu a few weeks ago. I really like that game. I think it's better than Tawantinsuyu, but I do like Tawantinsuyu. Now, Tawantinsuyu has players in this setting, this Incan Empire setting. They've got a high priest on this kind of central dais in the middle of the board. The priest can move around there and take different actions. When you do that, when you activate that high priest and you take one of those actions, other players will get to do a weaker follow version of that action. And then there's some other things that you can do, like getting more cards of different kinds and getting more worker meeples. The other thing that you can do on your turn, instead of using this high priest or getting the cards and things like that, is you will take one of your worker meeples and place them on an icon out there on the board. And depending on where that icon is in relation to your high priest, you have to pay various amounts of food. The farther the level you go down in the temple, the more food that you're going to have to pay. And the more you go away from where your high priest is standing, kind of around that board, you're going to have to pay more food as well. And then you've got different colored meeples to choose from. You'll get a certain number of actions depending on where you placed, depending on the colors of meeples near them. And you'll get to do things like get more food or get more stone or build buildings which will give you ongoing bonuses, or they may be production buildings that generate resources for you. You can build statues which will give you potentially resources when you play certain types of cards, and you'll be trying to go up this temple track to get more resources and points during the festival scorings that happen a few times during the game, 3. And you'll also be sacrificing some warriors to do some area control in various parts of the board, and that'll get you points as well. There's a nice grab bag of mechanics in this game, and I really liked it a lot, but there are some elements in the rulebook that are very unclear. And there's also a very big player aid, and the way that it describes things in the player aid and in the rulebook are not always consistent. So sometimes you're going back and forth trying to put together what you're actually supposed to be doing between the partial information on the player boards and the partial information, which is different, in the rulebook. So there's a little bit more of a barrier to entry in learning this game, just the way the rulebook and the player aids have been designed, and not everything is always clear. It's not necessarily that complicated a game, although it is a heavy Euro, but it's made a little bit more fiddly and a little more complex because it's not explained as thoroughly as it could be. So I think for my money, I'd always pick Tekenyu over Tawantinsuyu. I believe I rated Tekenyu a 9.0, and I know I'm going to come in right now with a score for Tawantinsuyu of 8.0. So it's a heavy Euro that I really enjoyed. I hope to play it more, but it's not quite at the same level of a Tekenyu or like a Bonfire. Now, I believe I'm going to be playing Tawantinsuyu again in a few more weeks, a 3-player game. I played a 2-player game this week, so maybe my opinion on the game will change a little bit after playing it again and playing it at a 3-player count. So just to recap scores for this week, Bonfire is going to get a 9.0 for me. Broom Service is being brought down to a 5.0, and that is a final score. The Fox in the Forest is coming in with a 4.0, and Tawantinsuyu, the Inca Empire, is an 8.0. And now that I've talked to you about the 4 games that I've played this period, let's continue forward and talk about those 5 crowdfunding campaigns that are going to be completing their funding this coming week. The first of these games is called Maul Peak. This one had a minimum required funding goal of $20,000. They're currently at $117,000, which is about 6 times that minimum required funding goal. It's going to be completing its funding on Monday, April the 25th. Now, this is exclusively a 2-player game. It plays in about 40 minutes. The complexity on it is medium light, and we're going to set the risk associated with this campaign at medium low. Now, if you don't know anything about this game, it is sort of a spiritual sequel to a game called Skulk Hollow that was kickstarted a few years ago. I think maybe it was back in 2018. And that game seemed to me to jump off of the successive route a little bit. They made another game that uses very cute forest animals and forest animal meeples, but the game itself is very different. And it's got animals in it, obviously, these cute animal meeples. It's a fighting game, and it uses action points and hand management. So you're going to have one player playing this group of animals that are trying to take down this guardian, who's this big character, kind of like in that video game Shadow of the Colossus. So they're going to be climbing on the creature and trying to do damage at certain weaker points and execute different actions based on where they are, location, abilities, things like that. Skulk Hollow did pretty well. It did so well that they've now made the sequel game Maul Peak, and I think one of the coolest things is that you can play the games together. So you can use factions from one game imported into the other. You can fight the enemy from another game in the first one. You can do all kinds of mixing and matching with the 2 games. And if you don't have Skulk Hollow, that is also available through this campaign. In addition to that, if you really like the first game, it's the same artists, the same designers, the same publisher. So everything is the same, and the 2 games are really going to look of a piece, and they'll combine together really, really well. So the 2 designers here are Eduardo Baraf and Keith Matejka. Eduardo's worked on Herbaceous, Skulk Hollow, and Sunset Over Water, and Keith Matejka's worked on Role Player Adventures, and Skulk Hollow. The 3 artists are Dustin Faust, or perhaps Dustin Fu, depending on how he pronounces it. He's worked on Heroes and Tricks, Heroes Welcome, and Skulk Hollow. Sebastian Cousineer, who's previously worked on Bullet, Dice Hospital, and Heroes of Terranoth, and Helen Zhu, who's previously worked on The Island of El Dorado, Skulk Hollow, and Sunset Over Water. And the game is being published by Pencil First Games. That's Eduardo Baraf's company, and they have previously published Herbaceous, Skulk Hollow, and Sunset Over Water. Now, when I'm talking about the various pledges of a game, I never talk about retailer pledge levels or group pledges. Those are just both pledges where you're getting multiple copies of the game. So I stick to the pledge levels that your average backer pledging just for themselves are going to be considering. We've got 2 of those pledges in this campaign. The first is $45. It's called Maul Peak. That will get you the base game as well as the Ancient Relics mini expansion. That is essentially just a few extra promo cards, part of the Kickstarter. So that's something that you won't see if you get the game at retail. And they did a similar thing when they did Skulk Hollow. So if you're to pledge Skulk Hollow through this, you will get a similar mini expansion for Skulk Hollow. And you'll also get the Runes and Ruins solo adventure, which is a solo adventure, a little narrative adventure that you can play, like a mini campaign that you can play using the game. Now for $90, which is the pledge level called Maul Peak and Skulk Hollow, you will add on to that pledge Skulk Hollow along with the Ancient Relics mini expansion for Skull Hollow. Shipping in the continental US is going to be $15 for the first pledge and $22 for the second pledge, and Pencil First Games is planning to deliver Maul Peak in May of 2023. The second campaign of the weekly is for a game called Silicon Valley. They had a minimum required funding goal of $11,000. They're currently at $22,000, which is about 2 times that minimum required funding goal. This one's going to complete its funding on Tuesday, April the 26th. It's a game for 1 to 4 players that plays in about 60 to 90 minutes. Complexity is medium light, and again, we're going to set the risk associated with that campaign at medium low. Now, this is a economic and tile placement game that's designed by Scott Alms, who has designed the Tiny Epic games, and players are essentially entrepreneurs of tech startups who are competing against each other with their company. Scott Alms, the designer, has more specifically worked on Heroes of Land, Air, and Sea, as well as Tiny Epic Dinosaurs, Tiny Epic Galaxies, and Tiny Epic Quest. He's done all of the Tiny Epic games, but those are the 3 that are the most highly rated on Board Game Geek. And the artist is Carrie Aitken, who's previously worked on Boomerang Australia, Boomerang Europe, and Tichu. Grail Games is the publisher. They've previously published Medici, Stevenson's Rocket, and Yellow and Yangtze. This is another very simple campaign with not too many pledge levels. There's 2 pledge levels. For $29, you can pledge at the startup pledge level, and that will get you the basic version of the game. For $50, you can pledge at the entrepreneur level, and that's going to add in 2 more things to your pledge. Plastic code blocks, which will replace the cardboard code blocks in the game. It's a tile placement game, so those are essentially the tiles that you'll be placing out during gameplay. So in the standard version of the game, it's cardboard. If you pledge at the entrepreneurial level, those will get upgraded into these plastic tiles and an upgrade to metal bitcoins. Now, whatever pledge level that you pledge at in the continental US, shipping is being estimated at $12, and Grail Games is planning on delivering this one in March of 2023. Now that brings us to a game called Aldarra, which had a minimum required funding goal of $200,000. They're currently at $276,000, which is over 1 time that minimum required funding goal. Now, it's likely that by the time they complete their funding, they will get up to maybe 2 times that funding goal, but probably not much more than that. Aldarra is going to complete its funding on Thursday, April the 28th. This is a game for 3 to 4 players, and I think that's important to be stated. So if you're getting this one and you think you're going to play it with a 2-player count, it's not going to happen. You need 3 players really to play this game. Game sessions are estimated to take 90 to 180 minutes. The complexity on the game looks to be medium heavy, and we're going to set the risk associated with this campaign at high, mainly because it's a new publisher, relatively new designers, and new artists. Now, this is a 4X game, and I think the biggest selling point of this game are these enormous chunky miniatures that you're going to be using in the game. However, they ran this campaign a month or 2 ago, and it didn't fund because it was very, very expensive, and the miniatures were enormous. And I think they hoped that people would jump on it because it's offering kind of a premium level of components for this kind of game. But it was just so far priced out of most people's price range that they relaunched. They brought some of the prices down, but those giant miniatures that were a huge selling point are now smaller. They're still big, but they're not the size of, your head or your fist, depending on how big your fist is. So the miniatures are not as big as they originally were, but they're still very big, and they're very detailed, and they've got a really good color scheme to them as well. Now, the other interesting thing about this campaign is there are a lot of STLs, files that you can either pledge or do as add-ons, and that will allow you, if you want, to print out these miniatures on your own, either the base miniatures, so you could pledge kind of a version of the game without minis, get the STL files, and then print out your own minis for the game. And there are also some STL things that aren't in the actual normal game itself. However, it must be said, and you'll see when we get there, that if you are trying to get all of the STL files and kind of everything in this campaign, it's going to get very expensive. So if you're interested in this game, you're going to need to check what you can spend and kind of work backwards and find a solution that will work for you. But if you have a lot of money to spend, there are a lot of ways in this campaign to blow through that cash. Now, the game is co-designed by Matt Fantastic, who's previously designed Team 3 Green, Team 3 Pink, and That's Not Lemonade, and Benny McLennan. And there are 3 artists on the game. The first is CZ and Pacu. The other artists are German Wallach Verona and Jorge Jacinto. And the game is being published by Arcane Minis. They've done a few campaigns before for miniatures, but I believe this is their first board game and their first Kickstarter for a board game. And that's some of the reason for the high risk associated with this one. It's very ambitious in terms of what they're doing. It seems like they have the kind of miniature angle already figured out since they've worked on miniatures previously, but it's an expensive project, and technically it is their first board game Kickstarter as well as their first board game. So there's still kind of a lot of unknowns out there, I think. Now, the first thing that you can pledge for is for $25. It's called STLs, and that is going to get you the files for the 28 miniatures in the base game and the 14 miniatures in the Savage Skies expansion. It won't actually get you the games at all. It's just going to get you the files for those miniatures. For $135, you can pledge for the base game, and that will get you the base game with the miniatures already included in it. For $235, you can pledge Aldarra All In. That will get you the base game and the Savage Skies expansion and a lot of these STL files, as well as a Kickstarter upgrade pack. Now, in that pack is going to be things like extra dice sets, more miniatures, and some upgraded tokens and components and things like that. From there, we go to add-ons. So for $20, you can add on metal coins. For $10, you can get the Kickstarter Extra pack, the STL files only. For $30, you can get the Kickstarter Extras, and that will include everything like the dice and the additional miniatures and the upgraded components. For $25 as an add-on, you can get those STL files. It's the same thing that you can pledge as the very first pledge level, which is also $25. And there are 6 different factions in the game. There's 4 in the base game, 2 in the expansion. Each faction has 7 miniatures, so essentially that is the STLs for 42 different miniatures. For $130, you can add on the Sorta Light Elixir Premium Dice Set. So this is a dice set that is $130 just for the dice set. And the reason is, in the middle of these dice are kind of swirling liquid and glitter. So as you roll, they will move around and the dice will have the appearance of, having this interior that's kind of swirling and moving. It's very, very cool. Whether or not it's worth $130 on its own is up to each person individually to judge, I think. Probably not for me. For $30, you can pledge for the Savage Skies expansion, and that's without the miniatures. And the reason that you might want to do that, you can think about this as I continue to talk, but you can pledge for both the expansion and the base game without any miniatures, and it's very cheap. And then you could pledge for the STL files and print out your own miniatures. So for $45, you can pledge the base game, no minis. For $100, you can pledge the Savage Skies expansion with miniatures, and for $140, you can pledge the base game with miniatures. That is obviously a second copy. If you're pledging and then you add on a second copy, it's $140. Now, let's say you did decide to go to the STL route. You're going to print these things, yourself at home. You're going to need all these resin kits to be able to do that printing. So for $20, you can add on a bag of Arcanite resin. That is a 500 gram bag, and that is enough to print out 1 faction. So you're going to need at least 4 of those for the base game, 6 if you get the expansion, and then another bag to do the clear stands. So you would really need at least 7 of these bags, but you can buy 1 bag for $20. For $45, you can buy a bag of Arcanite resin. It is 1.5 kilograms. So it's essentially 3 times as big as the 500 gram bag. Now, the thing about that, though, is it's all the same color. So you're probably not going to use the same color to print out more than 1 faction. So essentially, if you got that big bag, you'd have enough to print out the faction miniatures 3 different times. And you may want to print out some of the other things. As we get deeper into this, there are some additional STL files that aren't represented elsewhere. So you may be able to use some of those resin bags to print out additional components. But in general, if you're just trying to print out the base game and the expansion miniatures, you probably don't need a bag that big. For $88, you can get the Arcanite Resin base game set that's going to come with 5 of those 500-gram bags, which should be enough for the base game because you'll have 4 different colors and then you'll have 1 for the clear stands. For $140, you can get the Arcanite Resin all-in set. That'll come with 8 bags. Essentially, you would need 6 different bags for all of the factions, 1 clear bag for the stands, and then you'd have a bag left over that you could do whatever you wanted with. Maybe you'd use it if you needed to reprint certain things. Maybe you'd get more clear so you could print out extra stands. Or maybe you'd get something for some of these STL files that aren't included elsewhere. But it would give you 1 more bag than you need for the base game, the expansion, and the stands. For $165, you can pledge Arcanite Resin, and that's going to be 4 bags that are 1.5 kilograms each. So it's essentially 3 times what you'd need for each of the base game factions. Maybe you're worried they're not going to print out perfectly, so you're going to need more than what you would need just to print out things, for backups. Or maybe if a mini gets broken or lost or something, you can reprint it out. But that is more resin than you probably need. Now we're going to get into some additional STL files that are for miniatures that aren't seen otherwise in the game. So these are kind of in addition to everything else. So for $105, you can add on the Skies of Sordain core bundles. That's going to give you 5 different STL bundle files with all of these different things, and then a file for a frigate. For $150, you can add on the Skies of Sordain expansion ships. That's just even more STL files, and I believe it includes 12 different unique ship STLs. For $425, you can add on the entire Arcane Minis STL library. So that will give you all of the STLs for the base game, the expansion, and then all of these additional things. And then for $25, there's an add-on called Discovering Aldarra. I'm not actually sure what this is because it talks about the miniatures in this needing characters that are level 3 to 4. However, the game is a 4X game, and it's a competitive game. So they haven't mentioned otherwise in this campaign that there's going to be, like a solo campaign or an exploration campaign. So the fact that they're talking about it's being used with characters that are levels 3 to 4, I'm not seeing that explained elsewhere on this campaign. Just trying to be clear about that. Now, they do talk about it being a story that takes place 10 years before the campaign. I know there's 12 STLs involved in this pledge, as well as some maps and things. So I believe what this is some sort of little narrative campaign that you can play on your own, and there are some STLs specific to that. But there's not really more information that I was able to find about it, either on Board Game Geek or on the Kickstarter page. Continental US shipping for this is estimated at either $35 or $45. That's going to be for the 2 pledges, the 2 main pledges. So not the STL files, but for the base game, $35, for the Aldarra all-in, $45. And I'm assuming if you add a lot of add-ons for like resin packs and things like that, the shipping will probably be even more. The STL files probably not because they're files, but if you're adding on some of the extras and the resin kits, I'm assuming the shipping will go up. And then finally, Arcane Minis is planning on delivering Aldarra in June of 2023. Next, we move to a game called Legacy of Thracks: The Awakening. This is another game that's just barely made their minimum required funding goal and funded already. So that minimum required funding goal is $50,000. They're currently at $52,000, which is just over 1 time that minimum required funding goal. However, they have funded, and usually campaigns on the last day will do about half of what they did on their first day. So I don't know if they'll hit 2 times funding by the time that they run their campaign through. It's possible, but I don't think that it's going to, go back and become unfunded. I think they are safe and funded. Legacy of Thracks is also going to complete its funding on Thursday, April the 28th. Legacy of Thracks plays 1 to 4 players in about 90 to 150 minutes. The complexity on this game appears to be heavy, and the risk associated with this campaign I'm going to set at high. Again, it's a case of the designers, the artists, and the publisher generally being new and first-timers and running a Kickstarter for the first time. Now, this is a competitive fantasy game. It's got some semi-cooperative elements in it. It kind of borrows both from Ameritrash because it's sort of a dudes on a map game. There's narrative, exploration, things like that. But it's also got some Euro elements to it, like resource management. In fact, even though it is a dudes on a map game, essentially, there's not that much combat in it. So if you're looking for the kind of game where you're going to chuck some dice and fight and things like that, that's not really how this game is going to work. It has that American game feel in the look and the design to it, but the competitive element is going to have to do more with completing goals and things like that. So it does lean more into the European design in terms of the way that you're trying to beat your opponent. It's not direct combat so much as it's a completion of goals and managing resources to achieve those goals. It also has a solo mode designed by David Turksey, which is very cool. I love him. I think he's a great designer. He does a lot of solo modes, and it's kind of interesting that he's working on this one from a newer publisher, but it's a great boon for them. Also, there are a lot of different game modes in this, so you can play it almost any way that you want. There's the solo mode, there's competitive versions, there's cooperative versions, there's like 2v2, there's kind of every permutation you could think of. Now, it's designed by Balázs Sveda, and this appears to be his first design, or at least his first big published design. And the three artists on this game are Kanek Attila, Victor Koch, who's worked on a game called Pumpkin Patch Bad Seeds, and Istvan Stravan. And it's being published by Sveda Studio, which is Balázs Sveda's company. Now, there are three different pledges for this one. For $79, you can get the base game. There is this 60-page storybook, so if you pledge the low pledge, just the base game, you're going to be getting a digital version of that storybook. If you pledge at $89 for the Kickstarter Deluxe Edition, you'll be getting some upgraded components and some stretch goals that are specifically for the Kickstarter version. And then finally, if you pledge $107, which is the all-in pledge, you're going to be getting some pre-washed minis. There are about 7 minis in the game, so it's not a huge miniature game, it's more player characters. So every player has their own player character miniature, and then there are a couple other kind of NPC miniatures. So it's not a huge miniature game with all these warring armies. It's more player character miniatures, and those will get the wash at the highest level. You'll also be getting a custom shadow power marker, which is kind of a tracker, a little miniature tracker. And then that 60-page digital manual will instead become a hardcover book. So you'll be getting a physical version of that 60-page digital illustrated manual. Now, if you don't want the all-in pledge, but you want 1 or 2 of those items, you can do them as add-ons. For $8, you can get the illustrated storybook. That's the hardcover version. For $6, you can add on the custom shadow power tracker. And for $12, you can add on those pre-shaded miniatures. And again, there are 7 of them in total. Now, continental US shipping is being estimated at $19, and the game is planning to be delivered in August of 2023. The 5th and final game on this list is called Paradox Initiative. This one had a minimum required funding goal of $30,000. They're currently at about $51,000, which is about 1.5 times that minimum required funding goal. Paradox Initiative is going to complete its funding on Friday, April the 29th. This is a game for 1 to 4 players. It plays in about 30 to 90 minutes. Complexity on the game is medium light, and we're going to set the risk associated with this campaign at medium low. Now, this is a game about mad scientists claiming strands of space-time from across the worlds of the multiverse. And it's got things like card drafting, resource management, and set collection. And each player has a player area with a grid of tokens that kind of functions like a mobile game like Bejeweled. So you'll be interacting with this grid and these resources and kind of playing a mini game with them to be able to do things on the main part of the map. It's designed by Brian Sewer, who is actually redesigning a previous game of his called Paradox, which has a pretty good pedigree behind it, but they've upgraded everything. made it even nicer and tweaked some of the gameplay. Brian Soar has previously designed Coldwater Crown, Freshwater Fly, and most recently, which was a Kickstarter that delivered within the last month or two, people are kind of playing it now, it's called Merchants of the Dark Road. Now, it's a little hard to determine who's the actual artist on the game, and the reason for that, and we'll get into this a little bit later in this entry, they've got this thing going with different neoprene player mats. So you don't have to use player mats. You could just play the game without them. But if you want a player mat, it gives you a space to put your cards and all of these, this grid of tokens that you're going to be using. And they've done something very kind of cool. They've employed 18 different artists, really amazing artists, and each one has designed a different player mat. Now, this is a 4-player game, which means you don't really need all those player mats. So you may want to pick and choose. You may just want to pick out 4 mats. That's most that you would need to play it at max player count. But if you really want to go crazy, you could get 18 different versions of these player mats, each by a different artist. Now, all of those artists have been credited on Board Game Geek, so when you look at the listing, there's a list of like 20 different artists. I do know that Matt Paquette is involved in this. He historically has kind of done more graphic design, but he has been getting into doing more and more art. So I'm not quite sure what his involvement is with the game. However, I think it's graphic design, because when I looked at the board game entry and I kind of cross-compared all of the artists there with the artists who are working on all of the neoprene mats, there was one artist that was listed that didn't have a neoprene mat. So I believe he is the artist for the main art in the game, and that is Sebastian Cavio, who has previously worked on Minara, Not Alone, and When I Dream. Now, like I said, I know Matt Paquette is involved. He may be doing some of the art as well, but my guess is that he's probably handling more of the graphic design, and Sebastian is doing the art for the game. Not the playmats, but everything else. Paradox Initiative is being published by Elf Creek Games, and they have previously published such games as Atlantis Rising, the 2nd edition, Honey Buzz, and most recently, Brian Soar's previous design, Merchants of the Dark Road. So there are essentially 4 different pledge levels for this one, although the higher 2 are all about the play mats. So for $39, you can pledge Paradox Initiative Standard. That will get you the standard version of the game and the normal stretch goals. For $69, you can pledge Paradox Initiative Deluxe, and that will get you upgraded tokens. So I mentioned every player is going to have these player mats with all of these tokens. It's kind of like a bejeweled grid, but that means they may have a lot of these tokens on their board. There are a lot of these tokens in the game. So that $30 jump up in price is just upgrading all of those tokens from the cardboard tokens of the standard version of the game to a kind of clay composite that's going to be used in the deluxe version of the game. Now, if you want some of those premium play mats, so that every player has their own playmat, the cheapest bundle there is for $135. That's the pledge. It's called Mad Lab Assistant, and that's going to get you 4 playmats, which you'll be able to choose in the pledge manager specifically which of the 4 artists you want, as well as a playmat box. Now, you can also get those things as add-ons. Every playmat is going to be $15, and each box is going to be $15. And the boxes essentially hold 4 playmats each. Now, if you want everything, if you want all of the playmats, there is a pledge for that. It's $329, which is a huge jump up for a game like this, right? With a standard edition that's selling for just $39. So you can get the very budget version of the game with no playmats, or you can spend a lot of money and get 14 more playmats than you will ever need when you're playing the game, because 18 playmats total for a 4-player game, with a lot of cool art though from a lot of artists. So that $329 Mad Scientist pledge is going to include all 18 playmats and 5 different playmat boxes. That means you'll get 4 playmats in each of 4 boxes, and then that 5th box will have 2 playmats in it and some room left over. Now, if you add up those amounts, what that would cost if you were kind of doing it all as add-ons, $15 for each of 18 playmats, plus $15 for each of those 5 boxes, would total out to $345, which is more than this pledge. So essentially, you're getting a $16 discount on all of that stuff, and the entire $69 deluxe version of the game for free. So if you wanted all those playmats, it is definitely a good deal. It's just a lot of stuff that the average gamer won't need when they're playing this game. Again, you can do these as add-ons. Each playmat separately as an add-on is $15, and every box that you buy that will hold 4 playmats is also $15, so you can get those as add-ons. Shipping in the continental US is going to be either $10, $13, $22, or $40 for each of those 4 pledge levels. So $10 for the standard, $13 for the deluxe, and then once you start to add on playmats, those shipping costs start to rise. So that bundle that gives you 4 playmats in a box will jump you up in shipping to $22. And then if you're getting that Mad Scientist pledge with all 18 mats and 5 boxes, you're looking at $40 in shipping. And finally, Elf Creek Games is planning on delivering Paradox Initiative in February of 2023. Now, normally I'll talk to you about the games that I actually pledged from the last video. Last week's video featured the games Dead by Daylight the board game, Feralis Obscure Land, and Mercurial. I did not pledge any of them, so I pledged none of those 3 games. I actually did pledge Mercurial originally, and then I started to look at the game more. It's got an amazing production behind it, really nice card art. It's got some foldable dice trays that, if they print them out in a way that is similar to the original designs, they're going to be very high production level and just look gorgeous. But the more that I was looking at this game, the more I was realizing that it's essentially a card drafting game. You're getting certain cards and generating resources and then buying better cards, kind of like Splendor or Century Golem Edition or Century Spice Road. I mean, those last 2 are the same game. The thing is, I already own Century Golem Edition, and I own the other games in that series, and I own the playmats for them, and I can kind of combine them into the games where you have 2 games that you play together, or there's one huge game where you can put all 3 games together and have it be this massive mega game. So I'm already committed to having that in my collection. And Mercurial, as cool as it looked, it just has so much in common with Century Spice Road or Century Golem Edition that I didn't feel the need to get that and bring it into my collection. I think if you don't have those other games, Mercurial would be a great back and a great game to buy, and it's going to have great production value. But for me, I already have a lot of games, and more than anything, I'm really looking to move games out of my collection. So I thought Mercurial just kind of repeats what I already have. I don't need another game that does the same thing, so I ended up canceling my pledge. Finally, let's talk about the 4 games that I've acquired into my collection since the last video. Now, this was mainly because I wanted to order one game. I pre-ordered it. It's a heavy euro. And then I filled out my cart with a few other things. So one of those things was Fantasy Realms Cursed Hoard. I really like Fantasy Realms, and I think when you compare it with Red Rising, which is a game that Stonemaier Games put out a couple of years ago, I actually pre-ordered that one because I knew that it was going to be like Fantasy Realms, based on the Red Rising book series. I think the Red Rising game is vastly inferior to Fantasy Realms. So I'm selling it from my collection. I've already purchased Fantasy Realms, and this is my opportunity to get this expansion, which will make Fantasy Realms even better. So my advice to anybody, if you're trying to decide between Fantasy Realms and Red Rising, is to go for Fantasy Realms. And if you're looking at Red Rising now, considering buying it, maybe go take a look at Fantasy Realms and see if that's going to do what you want even better, because I believe that it does do it better. I also picked up 5 Tribes, Whims of the Sultan. 5 Tribes is a game that I consider to be an evergreen. There's enough in it, the heavier gamers I think can play it and be satisfied, but it's not going to alienate lighter gamers. So it's one of these games I think that kind of sits in the middle and everybody can play together. And I really like it. I think 5 Tribes is a great, amazing game. A game that, depending on your individual sensibilities, is probably a very, very solid addition to anyone's game collection. So I really like 5 Tribes, and I have the other 2 smaller expansions for it, but all of these expansions have been very hard to find and out of print. They did a reprinting recently of Whims of the Sultan. That is the expansion that has the 5-player upgrade, as well as some goal cards that you can incorporate into the game. So I kind of jumped on it when I realized, wow, this is finally available again. It hasn't been available for a while. It's been out of print and hard to find. So the main game here that I had wanted to acquire, that is the reason that I added on those other smaller expansions, is Golem, which I think has something in common with Abomination: The Heir of Frankenstein. It's all about players competing to create these creatures. In the game Golem, they're using the Golem creatures from Jewish history and mysticism. And I just have heard great things about this game already from a lot of people that I know that are heavier gamers. I think it's probably going to be a top 10 game for me this year, so it was something that I wanted to get into my collection as soon as I could and start playing it and seeing how much I liked it. So I'm very excited about Golem. I'm hoping to get it to the table soon, probably as soon as I finish playing the games that I'm still needing to get played from 2020. The last item on the list is Marvel Champions: Rise of the Red Skull. I have a decision to make here. I need to decide whether I'm going to be continuing playing Marvel Champions or Arkham Horror, the card game. I do have the base game from Marvel Champions, as well as some of the smaller character packs and a couple of the very early packs that were scenario packs. Like I think the Wrecking Crew is one of them, and I believe there's one for the Green Goblin. But I wanted a bigger expansion to be able to play with as well to make a final decision about what do I keep in my collection, Marvel Champions or Arkham Horror, the card game. So I think I have now acquired everything that I need or want from Marvel Champions to make that decision. Now I just need to sit and play through the base, play some different characters, play this first big expansion and see where I stand. I really, really like Arkham Horror, the card game, although sometimes it can be brutally difficult in certain scenarios, but I like the narrative storytelling of those games. So I think I'm leaning towards Arkham Horror, the card game, which means I'll spend some time with Marvel Champions. I'll see if both can coexist in my collection. I have a feeling the answer is no, which means I'll eventually be selling Marvel Champions. And once I do that, I may eventually pledge Sentinels of the Multiverse, the definitive edition, in a future Kickstarter campaign. I also feel like there's a lot of crossover between Sentinels of the Multiverse and Marvel Champions. So I think if I go with Arkham Horror, the card game, if I remove Marvel Champions, then it kind of opens up room in my collection to add in Sentinels of the Multiverse, which is another game that I really, really like. But I think that game is kind of covered between Marvel Champions and Aeon's End. It feels like it's kind of a combination of those two games for me. So I have a lot of games in my collection right now. I'm actually trying to remove things that do the same thing. So that's kind of my decision-making process that needs to happen in the future. And I think I now have everything I think I need for Marvel Champions to make that decision. So thank you very much for being here. This number up here is the number of those 2020 games that I still need to play before I can start working on my top 30 games of 2020. So this is what I have left. I'll be working on those over the next couple months, as well as getting my studio space and new equipment together and getting the space put together. So over the next few months, I'm getting married June 17th. You'll eventually see me in a different space with better equipment, and the channel will be changing somewhat as I start to do more things on a higher production level. That's all going to be happening in the background for right now, and until I get there, I'll just be continuing with these videos, which usually will come out on Fridays. I'm a little late this week because of some wedding things that I needed to work on. I hope this information helped you, whether it was the games that I played and how I rated them, or me talking about the campaigns that I'm most interested in that are going to be completing during this week. And maybe that helped you make a decision on what you're going to back or not back as well. If you want to sort of play along at home and try to figure out what I am going to back this week from those 5 campaigns, I'm backing one of them. So make your guesses. If you want, you can put them in the comments down below. And then next week, I'll let you know which of those 5 games I actually backed. As always, if you go down into the description section, there are links to each of those campaigns that I was talking about. So if anything really interested you, you want to run over there, back it, or look at it more, you can just go down into the description section and click on the link. Boom, you'll be there. Please consider liking and subscribing. That's the thing that really helps me to grow the channel the most at this point. Have a great week, play lots of great games, and I will be back with another video. It should be publishing on Friday this week, as it normally will be, and I'll be talking more about games that I've played and campaigns that are completing their funding in the following week. Have a great week, and I'll see you again very soon.